Be prepared was the Boy Scouts' motto, embodying traits like trustworthiness, loyalty, helpfulness, friendliness, courtesy, kindness, obedience, cheerfulness, thriftiness, bravery, cleanliness, and reverence. Oddly enough, naivety, foolishness, idiocy, and misplaced trust also seemed part of this package. David had no other options. He seldom checked his wife's iPhone, a fact she was aware of, so she enhanced her security measures. As a Boy Scout, he valued honesty and respected privacy. However, with his wife's upcoming trip, David struggled to remember the name of her hotel, trying to avoid a potential argument about his forgetfulness. This had become a recurring issue lately. Their upcoming separation, the longest since their wedding 5 years ago, led David to think about romantic gestures like sending flowers. Yet Paris, a city of love, held a bitter irony. He wouldn't be her love interest there. Her companion Carrie would, using their wedding date as the passcode. David found himself sifting through work-safe emails exchanged between his wife and Carrie, detailing romantic plans in Paris. As surprising as the affair itself was the use of work emails by his wife Phoebe and her lover Carrie, both of whom were legal professionals and should have known better. Phoebe was a lawyer, and Carrie worked as a paralegal at her firm. Their shared experience in document handling and litigation exposed them to numerous emails, often uncovering affairs. Lawyers would then evaluate if these were relevant and how to minimize the damage. David hadn't paid much attention to the details of Phoebe's trip or the name of the hotel due to an uneasy feeling. His legal experience sharpened his intuition and listening skills. Something felt off when Phoebe initially mentioned the trip, describing it as a routine arbitration case that would leave no time for sightseeing, all while avoiding eye contact with David. Her casual demeanor contrasted with their shared dream of visiting Paris. David found her response peculiar, catching him off guard with the worst-case scenario. He hadn't anticipated an email subject line that struck him deeply. "Why don't you just lose the Boy Scouts so we can spend more time together and not worry?" This recent message from Carrie was countered by Phoebe's unsettling assurance. "I feel safe with him." Feeling a mix of betrayal and arousal, David composed his response, punctuated with a smiley face emoji. Uncertain about his next move, he decided to print the email using the Wi-Fi printer in the basement, seeing it as a precautionary measure. Drawing from his experience as a seasoned lawyer, his primary concern was to preserve evidence by printing and stashing the email in his computer bag, taking a moment to think. David crafted a plan, seeing it as a win-win situation. He considered feigning a romantic gesture toward Phoebe, only to abruptly collide his face with one of the trees in the woods behind their house. On the other hand, he surmised Carrie would show less mercy in a similar situation. David needed to strategize carefully. It was his capacity for strategic thinking that defined him as a lawyer, valued for his intellect rather than physical prowess. David had to act swiftly, knowing Phoebe would soon return from her run. But before delving into deep thought, he had tasks to complete. Finishing an assignment and securing a hotel booking, though not for sending flowers. He wasn't sure why he needed the hotel information, but he felt a sense of purpose in obtaining it. He located Hotel Tour Eiffel near the Trocadero, a short walk from the International Chamber of Commerce, where Phoebe and Carrie would be involved in their arbitration case. During the lovers' anticipated breaks from their hotel trysts, David hurriedly delved into researching Virginia's divorce laws, drawing from his memories of the bar exam 5 years prior. Recalling that infidelity was grounds for divorce and could impact alimony and property division, he also remembered defenses against infidelity charges, such as reconciliation. Swiftly vacating the house to avoid confrontation was imperative. At present, his intention was to leave Phoebe stunned into disbelief, employing a strategic approach akin to shock and awe. To dissolve the marriage, lies would be necessary, despite their inconsistency with Scout law. This was war, as famously stated by Winston Churchill. In war, truth is so precious that it must be accompanied by a bodyguard of lies. David viewed his lies as serving a greater purpose. Now unbound by oath, as he returned to the bedroom, David swiftly packed his belongings, placing the suitcases by the front door. He then gathered essential documents, bank statements, credit card statements, retirement accounts, car paperwork, pay stubs, mortgage statements, and Phoebe's latest student loan balance. Upon hearing Phoebe in the kitchen upon her return from her run, David put on a concerned expression as he ascended from his basement office, observing her drinking Gatorade with her brown hair tied back. He couldn't deny her attractiveness, though he found her actions despicable. David came to the realization that love was no longer alive. With a somber smile, he conveyed his plans to go to Paris. Phoebe's immediate reaction was evident, her complexion turning pale, her blue eyes losing their usual vibrancy. She questioned him about the destination, her initial shock fading quickly. David explained that Donald had called, informing him of the need to prepare a witness for his insurance case. He recounted the judge's frustration over a lost motion to compel, which had disrupted the court schedule. David expected to be on the road for a few weeks, but hinted at the possibility of occasionally stopping by for laundry. Phoebe expressed sympathy, suggesting that perhaps David's firm was hiring. David expressed a desire to join her in Paris, noting a flicker of worry on her face before she teased him about sending his resume, despite Phoebe's law school having a higher ranking than David's. She made a motion as if to hug him, but he evaded her and headed downstairs to his office, grappling with visions of striking her and struggling to keep them at bay. As Phoebe inquired about dinner plans, David explained that he couldn't stay and would grab something on the road, as Donald was eager for him to leave. Immediately, Phoebe followed him to the door, looking slightly concerned as he picked up his suitcases and departed. She declined a goodbye kiss, citing a sore throat and the possibility of a cold or allergies, expressing concern about him catching anything from her. David informed her that he wouldn't be back until Friday at the earliest, mentioning their upcoming stops in Roanoke and Baltimore. He couldn't shake the feeling that Phoebe was contemplating the unexpected possibilities his absence might bring. Waving farewell, he drove off, hoping she'd assume he was preoccupied with work and irritated about being called in on a Saturday. His acting abilities were somewhat limited, but he suspected she was already contemplating reaching out to Carrie. David drove until he arrived at the nearest shopping center with a coffee shop. Like many lawyers, he found solace in pen and paper. As he savored his coffee, he began jotting down cases. It dawned on him that he had never entertained the idea of reconciliation, not even as a consideration. Retribution seemed the only viable path forward. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the ringing of a phone from an unfamiliar number. Answering impatiently, he was greeted by Joseph Carpenter on the other end. Carpenter swiftly introduced himself as someone in the business of purchasing old houses to replace them with mansions, acknowledging the general disapproval of his work, but emphasizing the allure of receiving a substantial check. David was taken aback by the notion of tearing down their cozy home. However, he soon regained his composure as Carpenter proposed buying their house for demolition, citing the uncertainty of new construction timelines and offering a potentially lucrative deal if David and his wife were willing to sell. David couldn't help but smirk at the prospect, recalling how Phoebe had chosen the house shortly before their wedding. It was a ranch nestled in a serene setting, complete with a charming yard overlooking woods and a creek, with the added appeal of a treehouse visible from the bedroom window, a symbol of their envisioned family life. David found the location convenient, with easy access to major highways and a manageable commute to work. Informing Carpenter of his busy schedule in the coming days, David arranged to meet on Sunday morning. Carpenter reassured him that he had already evaluated the property from the exterior and didn't need access to the interior. Additionally, he indicated that he would likely handle the closing himself through a power of attorney for his wife, who was preoccupied with work. As they ironed out the details, David couldn't help but ponder Phoebe's perceived security with her Boy Scout, unbeknownst to her. David reflected on how the ideals of the Boy Scouts were rooted in military scouting, emphasizing skills like stealth and self-reliance. It struck him that Phoebe had unwittingly walked into a trap reminiscent of a military ambush. But before proceeding further, David resolved to conduct reconnaissance. With his plan in mind, he purposely knocked over his empty coffee cup and retreated to his car for privacy, dialing a number on his cell phone, and then another. He waited for a response, eventually connecting with Robert Cooper, a former private investigator David had collaborated with during his tenure as a corporate lawyer. Robert had frequently assisted with pro bono legal cases, a testament to David's dedication to public service. David recounted the urgent favor he needed, explaining the situation involving his wife and another man. Robert expressed disbelief at the audacity of David's wife and offered to handle the matter himself as a token of gratitude for David's past assistance in the Rivera divorce case, which had garnered significant publicity. David thanked Robert and proceeded to provide details about the house in the backyard, mentioning its direct access to the bedroom where his wife practiced martial arts with the curtains open. He suggested that Robert could utilize it for surveillance purposes, accessible by navigating through the woods and leaping over the creek after dark. David also mentioned his intention to install a camera outside aimed at the front of the house to monitor activities. After finalizing arrangements with Robert, David contacted Edward, a lawyer he intended to retain for his divorce proceedings. Despite Edward's initial confusion about the purpose of the call, David clarified that he required legal representation due to his wife's infidelity. After David briefed him on the situation, Edward suggested meeting the next day to commence work on the case, recognizing the necessity of gathering clear evidence of infidelity and navigating the complexities of the financial settlement. Acknowledging his wife's resources and support from colleagues at her firm, David assured Edward that he would handle the situation, expressing confidence in resolving it amicably. The next conversation revolved around potential retaliation, to which David responded that he had no plans for retaliation, preferring a wait-and-see approach for his next move. David then contacted Dorothy, tactfully broaching the subject after a brief silence. Dorothy expressed delight at hearing from him after so long, prompting David to request her assistance, mentioning Phoebe's recent behavior. Dorothy explained that Phoebe's actions had strained their relationship, but she agreed to help David as a friend. After David shared his plan with her, Dorothy responded with laughter, finding amusement in the situation. She agreed to assist David, acknowledging his ability to make her laugh. Expressing gratitude to Dorothy, David promised to treat her and her partner to dinner once things settled down. Dorothy accepted the invitation, confirming it as a date requiring privacy. To strategize, David found accommodation at an extended stay hotel outside Fairfax Beltway, far from their usual spots. Settling in, he ventured out for sustenance. Although not hungry, he recognized the need for food to counter the drinks he intended to consume. Choosing the nearby restaurant, Lee Fabiacci, despite the complimentary chips and cheese likely causing discomfort, he took a seat in a booth, noticing the bartender's gaze, but pushing aside the thought, preoccupied with his concerns. Noting the hints of Central American influence on the menu masquerading as Mexican, David ordered tequila, anticipating a brutal hangover the next day. As part of the ordeal, the waitress returned with top-shelf tequila and a glass, gesturing toward the bartender, who acknowledged him by pouring himself a generous serving. David recalled the bartender from Rivera's legal proceedings, always sitting alone in the last row, dining in silence. He made notes and drank tequila after clearing his plates. He visited the break room, feeling the surroundings sway like a ship. Upon returning to the booth, he'd found the bartender occupying the opposite bench, awaiting him. The bartender greeted David warmly, expressing gratitude for David's assistance in helping his cousin escape an abusive marriage. Despite David's attempt to downplay his involvement, the bartender continued, mentioning that his cousin's abusive husband had been severely injured in jail, potentially facing permanent damage. Taken aback by the news, David felt a chill run down his spine as the bartender relayed the information with a slight smile. David replied that he hadn't been aware of the extent of the husband's injuries, to which the bartender nonchalantly remarked that it was yesterday's news, curious about David's presence alone on a Saturday night. The bartender inquired about his wife's whereabouts, noting David's marital status with a knowing smile. David realized that the bartender must have witnessed an unexpected encounter between him and Phoebe at a hearing, followed by a kiss, admitting to some marital issues, including Phoebe's potential infidelity. Seeing no reason to conceal the truth, David responded with a familiar smile. The bartender suggested that while he might not be a lawyer, He understood the importance of keeping secrets and hinted at David's exposed notebook containing incriminating details and a to-do list. David shrugged off the security lapses, noting that at least no client's secrets had been compromised. The bartender questioned David about his desires aside from money, suggesting the possibility of seeking revenge. David expressed his desire to physically harm his wife, wanting to break her nose and blacken her eyes. The bartender cautioned David against such violent retaliation, reminding him of the potential consequences that could lead to jail time. David agreed, nodding in acknowledgement of the bartender's past assistance to his cousin. Despite her initial refusal of help, the bartender insisted on repaying the debt owed to David, attempting to interject by mentioning Robert's role in gathering evidence and the police's involvement in the case. He also enlisted a partner from his firm to ensure the proper handling of the criminal proceedings, accompanying his client to ensure respectful treatment by prosecutors. Despite David's objections, the bartender commended his efforts in assisting those in need and offered his assistance in return. When David expressed uncertainty about the bartender's identity, the bartender revealed himself as Owen Goodwin, also known as Joker to some. David jokingly asked if he had to sell his soul for a favor, to which Joker responded with a chuckle, stating it was merely professional courtesy. Joker then instructed David to provide his address, his wife's name, and her daily routine. He suggested getting a cell phone for easier communication and leaving a contact number at the bar. Joker advised David not to return to the bar, claiming it was for the best. David briefed Joker about hiring a private investigator, his intention to stay home until Phoebe's departure for France, and Phoebe's travel plans. Joker knew the location of the Paris hotel, but kept the method of obtaining the information vague. Just one question signaled David: is there any chance of reconciliation? Forgiveness? Mercy? I don't want doubts. Later, Joker queried, his smile replaced by a serious expression. David met his gaze, taking a deep breath and reflecting on his emotions. The path ahead was clear. Trust and loyalty were fundamental to him, lacking his marriage. Phoebe's actions had turned love into hate in his heart, though he might eventually become indifferent. That time had not yet arrived. No, David affirmed, visibly relaxing Joker. Okay, don't fret. When the waitress presented the bill, Joker dismissed her, but allowed David to tip generously. He also permitted David to take a bottle of tequila, advising him to use it carefully. David woke up Sunday morning without much of a hangover, arriving at Edward's law office at 10:30 to find Robert already there. Robert conveyed his findings, informing David that Phoebe was indeed with another man in their bed. He handed David a DVD containing evidence of their infidelity, cautioning against watching it. Edward expressed concern about David's decisions, but David requested a summary of the evidence. Robert recounted how he had observed Phoebe and the man, Kerry Martin, engaging in sexual activity in the treehouse, as David had suggested. They had identified Kerry Martin as Phoebe's partner and planned to draft a report and affidavit for Edward to file. Expressing regret for the situation, David decided to file for divorce on grounds of infidelity, but requested that Phoebe not be served immediately. He instructed Edward to file the paperwork on Monday afternoon before the clerk's office closed. Edward reminded David of his limitations in criminal law, cautioning that he wouldn't be able to help if David got into legal trouble. You'll be pleasantly surprised, David mentioned as he exited. His next destination was a meeting with Joseph Carpenter. It turned out to be an exceptionally productive session where David discovered they could sell the house for more than the mortgage, and without any commission to the real estate agent. Phoebe would be thrilled. David assured Joseph that he'd have all the necessary paperwork ready to close the deal promptly. After leaving Joseph's office, David checked his phone. No messages, no calls. She must still be occupied with Kerry. David seized the opportunity to call his boss, Donald, urgently requesting 2 weeks of vacation or he'd resign. Realizing David's pivotal role in the ongoing case, Donald hastily agreed. Luckily, there was a lull in Donald's workload, allowing David some leeway with the groundwork laid. David returned to the hotel to dive into the real work by Monday evening. He was fully prepared. Throughout Sunday night and Monday, Phoebe left voice messages that he didn't respond to. He conserved all his energy for Tuesday morning, thanks to Robert's strategically placed camera outside the house. David knew Carrie had spent Monday night there, estimating Carrie's departure for work around 8:20 am, and Phoebe's at 8:40 am. David planned his move at 7:10 am. He entered through the front door, cheerfully announcing, "Honey, I'm home." He heard sharp footsteps upstairs, and then Phoebe came down the stairs in her robe, disheveled and shocked. Phoebe greeted David, attempting to sound cheerful, but appearing exhausted and divided. David apologized for his unexpected return, attributing it to the nature of business trips. He ignored the wine glasses in the living room and headed straight to the dining room, where he began arranging papers on the table. Meanwhile, Phoebe, fearing David's discovery of Carrie upstairs, hesitated before answering a knock at the door. David asked her to handle it as he continued with his task. To Phoebe's surprise, it was Dorothy who entered and greeted them. Phoebe watched as Dorothy joined them at the dining table and opened her briefcase. David explained that he had arranged financial and medical preparations for Phoebe's upcoming overseas trip due to his busy schedule. He also mentioned securing a refinancing offer for their mortgage and apologized for the short notice. Phoebe relaxed upon realizing that Dorothy was a notary, commenting on David's preparedness. Phoebe joked about him being her Boy Scout, though her cautious demeanor remained. David handed her a pen, pointing out where to sign on the documents and encouraging her to take her time reading them, expressing her trust in David. Phoebe swiftly signed all the documents before her. David hoped her trust was genuine as he handed each paper to Dorothy for notarization, prompting Phoebe to retrieve her driver's license. Dorothy photographed it and recorded the information in her notary journal, while David and Dorothy exchanged glances, trying to suppress their amusement. Phoebe offered coffee, but both David and Dorothy declined. As Dorothy documented the notarized papers and David sorted them into folders, Phoebe glanced up, anticipating David's next move and planning hers. Once Dorothy discreetly left, stowing her tools, she smiled at David when Phoebe wasn't looking. David gave Phoebe a reprieve, citing a need for a teleconference, and retreating to his basement office. Phoebe's shoulders relaxed. For now, she'd have time to usher Carrie out and erase any trace of his presence before David emerged from his sanctuary. David descended to maintain the illusion that Phoebe was still deceiving him. He pretended to ignore Carrie's footsteps and the opening of the garage door as Carrie's car departed, but upon hearing the shower running in the master bath, David gathered his belongings, exited through the basement door, and drove away without a word to his unsuspecting wife. 3 hours later, after a hearty breakfast at the diner, David found himself in Edward's office. Edward looked shocked. David affirmed to Edward that his wife had signed the necessary forms consenting to the divorce petition and waiving service of court notices. He confirmed that the forms were properly notarized. David also stated that his wife had agreed to a property division agreement, granting him all proceeds from a house sale, her cars and jewelry, leaving him full discretion over her belongings, with both parties retaining their respective retirement accounts without any alimony from him. When questioned about his wife's financial situation, David responded that she earns more than him anyway. Edward reviewed the documents, noting that David's wife agreed to exit the marriage with minimal assets and significant debt. David confirmed the accuracy of the information, attributing it to his wife's generosity. Edward briefly scrutinized David before returning his attention to the papers on his desk. David further confirmed that his wife had signed an affidavit admitting to infidelity, acknowledging her lover's presence in the marital bedroom at the time of signing, and affirming the authenticity of email correspondences discussing their affair. David asserted that the documents spoke for themselves. Edward, initially appearing surprised, eventually smiled. Recognizing David's respected reputation and their friendship from law school, he decided to proceed with filing the documents, admitting that everything appeared legitimate to him and expressing disbelief at David's actions. David expressed immense embarrassment to the judge, acknowledging that he had been consumed by his client's breach of trust. He mentioned that if anyone deserved disbarment, it would be himself. The judge then discussed with David whether the notary could confirm Phoebe's signature on the documents and if Phoebe scrutinized them. David affirmed that he was confident Phoebe had thoroughly assessed the documents. Due to her experience as a seasoned litigator, Edward indicated that he would file all the necessary documents that day, including Robert's affidavit and report, along with photos and a DVD. He mentioned his intention to keep the DVD out of the electronic file for the time being to avoid making headlines. David agreed, emphasizing the importance of keeping things quiet, especially with Phoebe's impending departure for Paris in just over 2 weeks. Edward asked David if he knew anyone at the county courthouse, mentioning Seth, a classmate from the following year who was now clerking there to boost his resume. Edward suggested that Seth might expedite the legal process, but cautioned that if the judge demanded live testimony, the case could collapse. He noted that Phoebe would need to decide whether to contest fraud on the court. Once she understood the situation, Edward mentioned that if things soured, he might have to part ways with David's representation. David acknowledged Edward's points and agreed to discuss the matter further someday, but not at that moment. Robert couldn't determine if they met elsewhere during the week or at the office, but it wasn't at home. He promised to update David if anything changed. David made some discreet moves while Phoebe was away, returning to the house to collect necessary financial documents and signing a contract to sell the house to Joseph Carpenter, with a schedule for Phoebe's first week in France. During this time, David focused on self-care, hitting the gym, indulging in leisurely reading, and reflecting on the state of his life by age 30. Robert reported the following Saturday that Phoebe was back with Carrie at the house. David thanked him for the update, expressing his indifference. He noted that once the house was sold, he would rather burn the sheets than sell them. By then, David had watched the video Robert had given him. Carrie, a few years younger, was a gym enthusiast, constantly admiring himself in the mirror post-workout. Otherwise, he was unremarkable. David was in decent shape, but lacked a chiseled physique. Phoebe evidently sought arm candy. David had no time for such superficiality. Before he knew it, Phoebe was off to Paris. A private investigator trailed her to the airport, confirming her departure for Europe. David then cleared out Phoebe's belongings, packed what he wanted, and had movers transport everything to a storage facility. Thanks to Joseph Carpenter's adept selling skills, David easily offloaded the furniture when the house was finally devoid of belongings. David did one final sweep before his last task. He meticulously collected the wedding photo album and Phoebe's gown, carrying them to the patio fire pit beneath the treehouse. He carefully arranged the photos and album on the embers, adding lighter fluid to the dress before igniting a match. As everything turned to ash, David was gratified to note the intricate details captured in the video, even discerning each photo's nuances as they merged with the flames. A day later, David finalized the sale of the marital home, utilizing his wife's power of attorney to sign on her behalf, though she really should have reviewed the documents with a separate financial power of attorney. David deposited the proceeds from a house sale into his personal account, certifying on behalf of his wife and closing joint accounts. 3 days later, however, during Phoebe's initial week in France, a construction crew demolished the house. Several days later, the rubble was cleared, and site preparations commenced. Unfortunately, the tree supporting the treehouse, beloved by the children, had to be removed to make way for a planned gazebo. However, construction abruptly ceased, with only a bare plot remaining due to an issue in the permitting process. David and a friend from law school employed in the county permit office remained optimistic that the matter would be resolved upon Phoebe's return from France, pending proper form approvals. Throughout this time, David avoided all communication attempts from Phoebe, offering evasive responses to inquiries. Joker informed him of Phoebe and Carrie's apparent stress, hinting that Phoebe might suspect something was amiss when asked about Phoebe's rings. David declined, leading Joker to suggest another potential recipient. David readily agreed 3 days before Phoebe's expected return. Unexpectedly, David received the divorce decree swiftly from Edward's office, departing. He received a call from Joker advising him to take a public vacation. Following the advice, he visited New York, reconnecting with college friends, engaging in various activities mostly funded by credit cards. He ensured recognition by staff through generous tipping at the hotel. While in New York, David overnight mailed a DVD to Phoebe's parents' house, showing him burning her wedding dress and album late one Sunday night. After enjoying coffee and cake in Little Italy, Manhattan, his phone rang. It was his father-in-law. "David, where are you?" "Phoebe's in the hospital. She's going crazy," his father-in-law exclaimed, his voice filled with worry. "Yeah, what's wrong with her?" David replied, intrigued by the unfolding situation. His father-in-law explained that Phoebe had returned from a business trip on Friday, but had apparently been kidnapped at the airport with a colleague. They were under medication and only managed to get out this morning. The co-worker was nearly beaten to death, and Phoebe, his father-in-law's voice trembled. She woke up covered head to toe in tattoos with horrible inscriptions. She was labeled a strumpet and a loose woman, and when she woke up and saw that some guy in a mask came in and punched her in the nose, breaking it, and then gave her 2 black eyes, his father-in-law continued, his voice filled with anguish. David found the situation strangely impressive, like the cherry on top of the ice cream. He would have been satisfied if Phoebe had realized his betrayal in court, just as she had betrayed him in marriage. But this was an unexpected twist of joy, a pleasure worth an immortal soul if he could give it away. "I'm sorry to hear that," David informed his father-in-law over the phone, explaining that he was out of town and inquiring about what he should do regarding Phoebe's situation. His father-in-law expressed surprise, reminding David that Phoebe was his wife. David then disclosed that they had divorced the previous week, accusing Phoebe of cheating on him with the man she was traveling with. Despite sensing his own cruelty, David offered to send his father-in-law a copy of the video as evidence. There was silence on the other end of the line, and David speculated whether his father-in-law was in shock. Eventually, his father-in-law declared that they were done with Phoebe, indicating that David would have to take care of her. After a moment of shouting, his father-in-law hung up, leaving David to ponder their strained relationship. It occurred to David at that moment that the stress of city life had been too much lately. He sent Donald an email, respectfully telling him and the firm to go to hell. After all, a quick internet search revealed that there was a backstore in Soho, and David got himself some new hiking and camping gear. Phoebe had never liked camping, so this was a chance to reconnect with her scouting past. The hotel was very accommodating and agreed to hold his luggage for a while for a reasonable fee, and David was on his way to the Adirondack Mountains to commune with nature until things calmed down. Luckily, he had his passport with him in case he had time to travel to Canada, and it turned out he did have time for most of the next 7 weeks. He turned his phone off. At first, he thought some crazy woman had stolen his ex-wife's phone, because there were dozens, if not hundreds, of messages that seemed to include frantic screaming and crying. He only listened to 1 or 2 and deleted the rest. There were lots of crazy emails too. Her account must have been hacked. How could he have taken the time to read all this? He hoped that whoever this woman was, she would get the help she so desperately needed. 7 weeks later, David met Robert for a drink. Edward was there too. Edward informed David that he had terminated their relationship with their attorney after serving David with a divorce decree, notifying him by registered mail. David admitted that he hadn't checked his mail yet. Edward characterized the situation as a significant problem, while Robert likened it to a widespread disaster. Edward then requested Robert to begin discussing the matter. On Monday morning, Mrs. Lawrence, accompanied by her parents, went to the old homestead. They hadn't removed the outside camera in time. Upon seeing the vacant lot, she had a complete breakdown, falling to her knees, sobbing and curling into a fetal position. Her tantrum escalated with kicking and screaming, reminiscent of a child in a late-night mall. When the equipment crew arrived, she lost her temper again. The third outburst occurred when construction workers noticed the tattoos on her face, resulting in laughter. The quality of the work was such that the text was very visible on camera, including phrases like strumpet and "I love face," despite her raccoon eyes and duct-taped broken nose. Edward explained that in the afternoon, Phoebe and a couple of lawyers from prominent firms entered his office without an appointment. After making them wait for 20 minutes, he made sure his Glock was loaded in his desk, taking advantage of Virginia laws. When the wait was over, they started berating him with talk of emergency motions, bar complaints, and contempt proceedings. He couldn't help but notice the ink all over his face, clearly written in red and blue for visibility. Once he managed to shift his focus, Edward inquired about the problem and which statement in any of the documents was false. They all stopped and looked at each other. Then he asked if there was an argument about David's ex committing infidelity, to which they all answered yes. Then he turned on the videotape he had prepared while they were waiting, and there was Phoebe clearly engaging in intimate acts in the marital bed with someone other than her husband. It was clear they hadn't familiarized themselves with all the case files yet, as everyone just looked at each other in confusion. Edward recounted that Phoebe began yelling that David didn't give her a chance to explain, to which he responded by saying that David didn't care about the reason as long as it got done. Eventually, she came to her senses and started telling him that she never agreed to let David sell the house, and that he burned her wedding dress, pictures, and album, claiming they were her personal property. Edward showed her copies of powers of attorney, one specifically for the sale of the house and the property settlement agreement, which gave David discretion to dispose of her personal belongings, and told her she was lucky she still had her clothes. He then asked if she denied that her signature was on the documents, to which she replied that she did not, but claimed she never agreed to anything written in them. Edward then questioned if her entire defense was that she never read what she signed, and asked her to imagine how she would be cross-examined if she challenged anything in court. At that point, she fell silent. He also pointed to an affidavit she had signed, admitting her lover was upstairs at the moment she was signing, and asked if that was true. This caused her to lose consciousness. Despite his attempts to revive her, he eventually called emergency. She refused to go to the hospital with them, but started yelling about tattoos and her boyfriend getting torment. Edward assured her that David had nothing to do with it as far as he knew, and that he was out of town anyway. Edward mentioned that Carrie might have angered someone else's husband by sleeping with her or another woman who thought Phoebe was attacking Carrie. Edward informed David that he had told the police department they could discuss any criminal cases they wanted to pursue, and expressed regret for missing the earlier altercation. He noted that the situation was improving, and they were still considering filing a motion for reconsideration. Things took an unexpected turn when Edward received an anonymous email containing links to video footage depicting Phoebe and Carrie engaged in intimate acts in front of the Eiffel Tower, while in David's bed. The email threatened to send the tapes to everyone Phoebe knows, claiming David was unaware and unable to prevent it. The sender claimed to be friends of David's and said they were offering protection, but also threatened to expose the tapes unless Phoebe backed off. David insisted he had no knowledge of this. Edward then recounted that after this revelation, the individuals involved left without further contact, and nothing more occurred at the courthouse. He also mentioned that detectives had approached Robert seeking copies of the tape and the report, but then lost interest in the matter. Neither Phoebe nor Carrie could recall the details of what had happened, only that they had taken a cab from the airport, and Carrie ended up hospitalized. Phoebe woke up in a seedy hotel, where she was assaulted and also ended up in the hospital. The room expenses were charged to her credit card, including room service and minibar charges. David mentioned that New York police and his friends had been contacted, all of whom confirmed his busy schedule in the city. Edward added that David's ex was reportedly undergoing laser tattoo removal in her parents' basement, which was expensive due to the extensive coverage. David commented on this, only a glance from Edward, and stifled laughter from Robert. Edward then brought up the condition of the individual referred to as the meat eater, stating that he was badly injured and would require extensive therapy due to multiple concussions. Finding another parallel job might prove challenging for him, as their firm had also let them go. Edward explained that their relationship had soured during the trip, affecting the arbitration negatively. Mistakes were made, exhibits weren't ready, and witness notes were lost, leaving the client displeased. Sacrifices were made to retain future work. Robert suggested that someday David would have to enlighten them about something, to which David responded jokingly, saying he was a Boy Scout. Robert continued, mentioning that Dorothy had waited in the car and expressing a bit of envy regarding David's situation. They agreed to discuss further over dinner, with David offering to treat them for aiding his liberation. As David drove away, Dorothy informed him that she didn't have a boyfriend. This surprised him but also pleased him, after which he suggested that they continue the meeting in a more intimate setting. Friends, I'd appreciate your thoughts on this story. Please consider subscribing to my channel and checking out my other videos.